We have the phono. One of the things that always surprises me most when I do launch a new book in this country is how many people, if they have liked my book, come up and say, I normally find history really boring, but. And there is a universal belief, it seems to be, in India, that history is the dull subject. That history is the thing that you try and sort of get through before you rush off to do exciting things like physics and chemistry. Now, where I come from, we did anything to get out of chemistry and physics, and but I used to love history. And it always surprises me that there is not more of a culture here amid this amazing renaissance of non-fiction that we've seen in this country over the last decade. Amazing travel writing, amazing long-form journalism, books like Sketu Mehta's Maximum City, really world-class non-fiction coming out of this country now in a way that wasn't the case a decade ago. But there's been no conquest of the history shelves internationally in bookshops in the way there has been of Indian and South Asian authors conquering fiction and travel. History and biography remain two subjects which still have yet to see, I think, the same sort of literary renaissance that we've seen in other genres. Well, my favorite history book of last year was Farah's The Origins of Sex, which I urge every one of you to rush out of this tent at the end, stampede the bookshop and buy. Anyone that thinks that history is boring will find a racier read than your average, I don't know, Irfan Habib, certainly. So, I don't want to get in trouble. Wonderful historian, but it certainly beats medieval Mughal field systems for a page-turner, this one. Farah will explain, I won't tread on his territory by outlining the story of his book, because I always find that when people do that for me, I then lose my first paragraph and have to completely redo the whole intro. But just to say that this book represents for me a real ideal, in that it is the confluence of years and years of detailed archival research with new material that's never been looked at before. But when Farah came to write up what was originally his PhD, I believe, a long time ago, he did so not in academic prose, designed only to impress a few fellow practitioners, but in really beautiful literary prose of a sort that would do justice to a fine literary novel. And it's a real treat. It's the most extraordinary subject, something that it never even occurred to me, the whole premise of this book. And you're going to have a very exciting 40 minutes ahead of you. Farah.
Thank you so much, William. And it's only 500 rupees. I'm going to, first of all, thank you all for coming very much. And thank you to William for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I hope we'll have time for a few questions afterwards. But I'm actually going to start with a question for everyone here, everyone in the audience. I sometimes ask this question in the West. I'm very interested to know what the answer is going to be here. It's very simple. If the answer is yes, please put up your hand. Who here has ever had sex with someone without being married to them?
Come on.
Okay, very interesting. A lot of hands going up and then down very quickly again. Yes. Okay, so I think that shows two things. It shows that a sizable proportion of this audience has done that, but more interestingly, I think it shows that that's a question about something that many people think of as quintessentially private. That was a slightly awkward moment, wasn't it? You're not used to strangers just asking you that in public. And that's because we nowadays tend to think of sex as something private. Sexual privacy and sexual freedom in the West today are things that we take completely for granted. Everyone can see that those are central to Western culture in all sorts of ways. People can also see that the West is distinctive in the world today in the extent of our sexual freedoms and the character that they take. And in the West, we think it wrong nowadays that in other cultures, people censure the discussion of sex, or that people suffer for their sexual orientation, or indeed that adulterers are put put to death. But Western society used to be like that too. And the central theme of my book is that how we think and feel about sex nowadays in the West, how we behave today, is the result of a huge revolution that only began in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. I've called it the first sexual revolution. So I want to start my talk today by taking you back to the pre-modern world, and I'd like those slides to come back up, if someone could do that. Those pictures that we had up earlier. Could we have the pictures? Excellent. Thank you. So I want to take you back to the pre-modern world in the West, the world before that first sexual revolution. That's a world in which sex was not private. On the contrary, except within marriage, sex was a public crime. And I'm going to give you an example of what that meant in practice, an example from exactly 400 years ago today. In the spring of 1612, 401 years ago, a man and a woman were arrested and brought before the magistrates in Westminster, in the south of London. And their names were Susan Perry and Robert Watson. And their crime was simply that they had had sex without being married. Worse still, they'd conceived a child. Susan confesses she was pregnant, it's quite obvious. Robert confesses, he says, nothing to do with me, it wasn't my baby, I didn't touch her. And so they're put on trial before a jury of 12 men, 12 middle-aged men pronounce on their fate. And they very quickly interrogate them and find them guilty. And for this crime, the judges order this man and this woman to be forever expelled from the society in which they live. They are taken straight that very hour out of the courtroom to the prison, where they are stripped naked from the waist. Where should I point the clicker? We didn't practice this earlier. There it is. Oh, yes. It worked briefly. Yes, there we go. If you look at the screen, you'll see a contemporary woodcut of exactly what I'm going to tell you about. Susan and Robert are stripped naked from the waist upwards. They are tied to a cart, and then they are whipped through the streets of Westminster for miles and miles until their backs are dripping with blood. They are dragged along like that, whipped and paraded in public humiliation to the edge of the city, surrounded by jeering crowds. And there, at the edge of the city, they are ceremonially dumped. Their punishment is not only to be publicly humiliated, it is to be banished for life, forever, to be cut off from their friends, their families, their livelihoods. They may never set foot in their town again. Now, this kind of treatment was a completely ordinary occurrence anywhere in the Western world up until the 17th century. Every day, people were arrested, flogged, imprisoned, fined, publicly humiliated for having sex without being married. Now, this was the law of the church and it was the law of the state, but it wasn't just imposed from above. It was enforced, it was animated, it was believed in very powerfully by ordinary people. Otherwise, it never could have worked. These are values that everyone, by and large, seeks to uphold. And there's no professional police force in this age either. It's a system of communities taking turns to act as watchmen, to act as magistrates, to uphold communal values. It's a system of self-regulation, if you like. This picture shows the neighborhood watch of local men going down a street in London, and the caption below explains that they are out to look for men and women having sex without being married. And in the picture you see they've found a couple. They've dragged them out of their beds into the street, and the caption explains the couple pretend that they're married, but of course they're not. And they're about to be taken to a magistrate and sentenced and punished. Now, it seemed obvious to people in this society that illicit sex was dangerous, that it had to be repressed because it angered God, because it prevented the salvation of people who engaged in it. If you had sex outside marriage, you would go to hell, and that it undermined social order in all sorts of ways. That's why sexual discipline was central to Christian societies. Now, obviously, many people did have sex even before the 18th century. I don't want to conceal that from you. After all, thousands of people were punished every year. Now, I think I've got the wrong picture, sorry. Where shall I put? Oh, there. It's right there. Ah! That's not the picture I want to show you. Okay, here we have it. That's the picture I wanted to show you. The beautiful, beautiful engraving, etching by Rembrandt, one of the very few from this age showing people in intimate embrace. So we know that many people had sex outside marriage because thousands of them were punished every year by the courts. And it's also true that popular attitudes were sometimes more liberal and tolerant than the official orthodoxy. As the leaders of the Tudor Church in the 1540s complained, for example, amongst many, fornication is counted no sin at all, but rather a pastime, a dalliance, a but a touch of youth. It's not rebuked, but winked at. It's not punished, but laughed at. They could not understand this attitude at all. So sexual discipline in the pre-modern West was never perfect. It was also very clearly biased. Women, for example, were more likely to be punished, wealthy and powerful men much less. But the general trend over time, from the very early Middle Ages through the Renaissance into the 17th century, is that it was getting more and more intense and more successful. By the 1650s, there are many Western societies where men and women were publicly executed for adultery. And all this had a very tangible effect on people's behavior. Most obviously, they had less and less illicit sex. We can measure this in the numbers of children born out of wedlock that drops very strikingly from the time that records begin in the 16th century all the way down to the later 16th century into the early 17th century. It gets less and less and less. And there's also a sharp decline in people having sex before marriage. The idea that sex outside marriage was wrong was clearly being more and more deeply internalized, just as the punishments were becoming more and more severe. The last person to be executed for adultery in England was probably a woman whose record I found in the County Record Office at Devon, a woman from a village called Bideford in the west of England. And she was called Susan Bounty. In the spring of 1654, she was arrested and tried and convicted of adultery. And when she was convicted, she was pregnant. And when she was sentenced, she said, "I'm pregnant." And so the judges humanely let her live on in prison until she'd given birth. And once she'd given birth, they took the baby from her and they paraded her to the scaffold and they hanged her by the neck until she was dead. So that's the world we've left behind. It was transformed forever by the first sexual revolution, which began around 1700, and I think was really one of the foundations of the modern Western world. And I've tried to show that in my book, available in the bookshop. I've tried to write a total history. I'm very flattered that many people have found it a great read as well. I don't want to give you the whole story of the whole book. I just want to pick out a few themes from it and especially show you some of the great pictures as well. So I'm going to throw up, I think probably the most extraordinary, that's it, the most extraordinary picture in my book. I want you to look at it. I'm not going to tell you what it is for a while. You can ponder it. So my first theme is going to be the rise of sexual freedom in the West. And the most obvious part of this first sexual revolution in the 18th century is the collapse of public punishment and a huge surge in the amount of sex that people have outside marriage. In the 1650s, we can measure that less than 1% of births are illegitimate babies born out of wedlock. 100 years later, in the late 18th century, that has risen to 25% of all firstborn children are born outside marriage. And 40% of women in England getting married in 1800 are already pregnant. That's a huge and unprecedented explosion, and that's a new, modern kind of sexual freedom from that point onwards. And the second thing about the sexual revolution is the birth of the idea of sexual freedom, the celebration of sex as the greatest and most important pleasure in life. This is a characteristic, a new idea of the Enlightenment. And exactly 100 years after the execution of Susan Bounty in 1654, it's summed up, I think, most pithily in a great line by the poet and politician John Wilkes in 1754, who wrote, "Life can little more supply than just a few good fucks, and then we die." I love that quote. It's often bleeped out when I say it on radio, but I'm happy to hear this microphone. Let me do it. I love that quote because it's not just a celebration of sex, but it's a celebration of a new attitude to the purpose of life and the role of sex within life, and pleasure and human fulfillment as being at the center of what we are all here for on earth. Now, sexual freedom and this way of thinking and behaving didn't come about in a vacuum. It was the product of the transformation of the whole of Western society at this time. And particularly important in social terms is new ways of living that emerge at this time, living in cities, in big, big cities. Urbanization is key to the new sexual outlook. The culture of sexual discipline had evolved in the West at a time when most people, almost everyone, 99% of the population, lived in very small rural communities where it was easy to enforce social discipline and religious discipline and indeed sexual discipline. But this is the point at which, especially in England, because England is in the vanguard here, people start to move to cities in a big way. And London in particular explodes. At the end of the Middle Ages, only about 40,000 people lived there. By 1800, more than 1 million people live in London. It's become the biggest city on earth. And by the early 19th century, most of the British population live in towns. And this new way of living creates unprecedented ways of interaction between men and women, new opportunities for sexual liaison, new opportunities for communicating ideas, and so on. So this is tremendously important. And in intellectual terms, this is the moment in the West of the great shift from a morality and a way of thinking and understanding the world based on faith, and religious faith in particular, to one based on reason. A shift from looking to external authority, to the Bible and to God for guidance on what's right and wrong, to looking to personal conscience and reason and attempts to define what is natural. And this new way of thinking about everything has a profound impact on thinking about sex and about morality. Okay, I'm going to come to the picture now, because the most extraordinary consequence of this new way of living and thinking is a huge explosion in sexual freedom. The most extreme manifestation of that is the foundation of sex clubs for men. And this is a ritual object from one such club called the Beggars' Benison, founded in the 1730s on the east coast of Scotland. Probably William's ancestors were there. Because, let me tell you, the members of this club were a completely respectable cross-section of middle-aged, prosperous men like William. And and like many of you, don't just laugh at William.
They were completely respectable, it wasn't.
Yes. Well, anyway, they're academics, they're businessmen, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're clergymen, and so on. And what they do when they gather together in their club is, first of all, they drink a lot of alcohol, and they have these hilarious ritual objects. They have wine glasses with huge phalluses coming out of them. They think this is hilarious, and they drink from these rather complicated things, and they sing songs and they read out pornography to each other, and they have young women come in from the countryside and strip naked so that they can ogle their naked bodies. And then in the climactic ritual that celebrates the purpose of their club and the existence of humans on Earth, they gather round this platter. It's very early in the morning for this, but anyway, they gather around this platter and they take out their erect members and they ejaculate collectively onto the platter. I'm very sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Here is a clergyman. Look at the clergyman. Okay. I've put the clergyman up though because this way of thinking and behaving is not just some extreme fringe radical way of thinking and behaving. It's part of the mainstream of 18th century culture, and many theologians and churchmen and serious men, and indeed some women, also argue for sexual freedom. This, for example, is a great Oxford Don, one of my predecessors, Matthew Tyndall, great fellow of All Souls, who wrote a great masterpiece of theology in 1730 called Christianity as Old as the Creation. And in that, he's trying to bring Christianity up to date. He's trying to use modern ways of reasoning, as most up-to-date theologians in the 18th century did, to think about how Christians should behave in the modern world. And in so doing, he ridicules all sorts of things that he sees as outdated superstitions that were, appropriate to tribes wandering around in the desert hundreds of years ago, but not to a modern state. And so he says, prohibiting sex outside marriage is no more sensible nowadays than stopping people lending money or eating blood. And what he says is this: enjoying a woman or lusting after her can't be said without considering the circumstances to be either good or evil. That warm desire which is implanted in human nature cannot be criminal when it preserves and promotes the happiness of the parties and propagates and preserves the species. So in other words, it depends on the context. You can't just say that all sex outside marriage is wrong. If it makes the individuals happy, why should it be prohibited? And many other Christian theologians thought the same. This is going to be Lancelot Blackburn, the Archbishop of York in the 1720s and 30s and 40s. At some point, left-hand one? Yes, there he is. I often dined with him, the diarist Horace Walpole reported of the Archbishop of York. I often dined with him, and his mistress, Mrs. Chris, sat at the head of the table, and his illegitimate son, Hayter, by another woman, sat at the bottom of the table, and we had a great time. And when the king's mistress came over, George II's mistress, the Archbishop of York did his duty and went to see the Queen and said, "Madam, you are a wise woman. I'm sure you do not mind your husband having a mistress." That's a very mainstream 18th century clerical attitude. I'm going to leave out lots of other examples of clergymen because I don't want to just talk about the celebration of sexual freedom. The second theme I want to talk about is the limits of sexual freedom. In many ways, the advance of this new way of thinking, as I've tried to indicate, is part of the mainstream of religious and sexual culture, but it has very different effects for men and for women, for heterosexuals and homosexuals, for different classes and different races. And this is also a central theme of my book. The new permissiveness towards what was seen as natural also sharpens up people's abhorrence of what they see as unnatural. What you can see on the screen now is a picture drawn from life in the 1820 by the French artist Géricault in London. It's a picture of three men about to be hanged, put to death, and quite likely at least one of them there is being put to death for having sex with another man. Because the clearest evidence for this new attitude is the increasing persecution from the 18th century onwards of same-sex behavior. Throughout the 18th century, into the early 19th century, men are regularly put to death judicially for this crime in England, and thousands more are harried and prosecuted and jailed and pilloried. The case of Oscar Wilde, which you may know about, is only the most famous of this. Even into the 20th century, such persecution becomes even more common until the middle of the 20th century. To curb or to exterminate homosexuality had become a major concern of public policy across the Western world. So a key effect of the first sexual revolution is also to sharpen the abhorrence of homosexuality as unnatural. And yet, at the same time, this sexual revolution also gave birth to modern homosexual ways of living and thinking, and the first assertions of what we would call gay rights as harmless and private and tolerated by God. I'm going to show you now a man called Edward Rigby, and I like to think this is the first English icon of gay pride, this print of Rigby as he stands there with his hand and his wig and all the attributes of his personality that he wants to show us. Now Rigby, this is remarkable because Rigby is one of the first martyrs of this new crackdown on unnatural behavior. He's arrested in 1698, he's sent to prison for attempting to have sex with another man. And a few months after he's released from prison, he has this portrait painted and engraved. I like to think it's an assertion of his being unbowed, of his standing there proud. And one of the most extraordinary documents I found in the archives was the police report on what Rigby would say to other men when he was trying to pick them up. For example, in November 1698, he goes to the fireworks in St. James's Park, and he mingles amongst the crowds, and he finds an attractive young man called William Minton, and he tries to pick him up. And he takes him back to a tavern, and he takes a private room, and he plies Minton with drink, and he moves closer and closer to him, and he ends up sitting in Minton's lap. He puts his arm around him, he puts his, as the police report says, he puts his tongue in his mouth, and finally he comes out with this, and he says, "William, shall I fuck you?" And William Minton says, "Oh, what do you mean? How can that be? I know not whereof you speak." And then Rigby comes out with this extraordinary speech where he justifies what he wants to do, not just as natural and as harmless, but as historically grounded. He says, "Do you not know that many great men have done it before us in our forefathers' time and throughout history?" Most explosively of all, he argued that Jesus himself had been the lover of St. John the Apostle. And he says to William Minton, "Our Saviour called St. John the handsome apostle for that very reason. Do you not read it in your scripture, William?" If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. Well, another one of my favorite examples from the police archives. In 1726, this is about a man called William Brown. William Brown was married. He's been married for 12, 13 years by 1726. And one night, he goes out cruising for gay sex. And he finds it. And in those days, you find it in Moorfields in the north of London, where it's very dark and open and men congregate there. Anyway, he's found gay sex. He's on the ground. Again, he's got his hand in the other man's breeches. And just at that crucial moment, they find themselves surrounded by the police, by a group of very hostile watchmen shining torches in their face, beating them with staves, saying, "Get out, what the hell are you doing? Come with us, you're under arrest." And here's the police report. They're arresting him, they're demanding him. At this very moment, they say, "What are you doing?" And I'm going to quote now, "He was not ashamed to answer. I did it because I thought I knew him, and I think there is no crime in making what use I please of my own body." Now that is our modern conception of sexual privacy in a nutshell, and that's one of its earliest applications to same-sex behavior. And it's extraordinary that a man on the ground whose life is about to be shattered should have the self-possession to come out with that in that way. And I thank him for that. Okay, there are many, many more examples. I'm not going to read them all out to you. I just want to show you a picture of this woman, Anne Lister. because the same arguments, exactly the same arguments, are also advanced first in English by this woman in her private diaries in favor of same-sex relations between women. She also writes that God would have mercy on her, God is not wrathful but tolerant, and that her feelings are natural. They are not, as she puts it, fictitious or taught. My conduct and feelings are surely natural because they are instinctive. And that is the great defense from that moment onwards of all forms of sexual behavior as being private. Okay, I want to move on. Here's someone I'm not going to tell you about, but go read the book and you will find out why he's so important. I'm going to move on to my third theme, which is the effects for women. The sexual revolution has very similar, very dual, very contradictory effects for women as it does for homosexuals. On the one hand, the idea that sexual freedom is as natural and as desirable for women as for men is born in the 18th century. And the most prominent early exponents of free love were the leading radical philosophers William Godwin and this woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. They simply did not believe in marriage, like many radical thinkers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As Godwin put it in one of his books, the institution of marriage is a system of fraud. And so by the early 1820s, people like the leading radical Republican Richard Carlile were putting out best-selling works to mass audience in which they advocated free love. There's nothing, as Carlile wrote, there's nothing in sexual intercourse that has any relation to morals whatsoever more than eating or drinking together with another person has. A true moralist sees no crime in what is natural. A true moralist will never denounce an intercourse between the sexes where there is no violence or harm or injury. Sex is the very source of human happiness. It is essential, he says, to health, beauty, and sweetness of temper. So that outlook is also born out of these new ways of thinking and behaving. But for women too, this is always only a minority outlook, because the main effect of the first sexual revolution is very unequal. It establishes a new commonplace, a new way of thinking in the West, which has it that men are always naturally, inevitably promiscuous. Men can't help it. But women, on the other hand, are supposed now, from now on, to be generally their sexual victims. Women, it's now increasingly argued, are naturally chaste and naturally asexual. And this is a complete revolution, a complete change from the old idea, for most of Western history, that women were the more lustful sex. I'm not going to tell you why it happens. You'll have to go and buy and read the book. But the effect of this new way of thinking is tremendous, because everywhere in the Western world in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, even today, we see the effects of this new commonplace, this new balance between male and female sexuality. It's also one of the foundations of modern feminism. Modern feminists from the 18th century onwards all take great comfort from this idea, from this presumption that women are more chaste. It seems to them a basis for women's superiority over men. And so from Mary Astle to Mary Wollstonecraft to Josephine Butler, all the great feminists presume that women are morally superior to men, and that goes right back to their greater sexual chastity. The great slogan, I wish I had a photograph, I brought a photograph of Christabel Pankhurst and her followers in the general election of 1913. Their great slogan was, "Votes for women and chastity for men." Those were the two things that were needed to make the world a better place. Okay. This also creates a huge shift in attitudes towards prostitutes, who are now seen as victims of something. Sorry, I haven't told you about this picture. This picture is from an illustrated version of a great novel by Samuel Richardson called Clarissa, and it shows the moment at which the evil anti-hero Lovelace is about to rape the heroine Clarissa. And one of the reasons I've put it up there is that part of the argument of the book, and part of, I think, the fun of reading it, is that I found that these new ideas are very, very powerfully propounded and taken up and become massively influential, partly because they're taken up by the new popular culture of the 18th century, by novels in particular, which provide a new way of getting inside people's heads, of talking about emotions and feelings and relationships in much more detail than the theatre had ever been able to do. And until the 18th century, the theatre was the main form of writing in the West. In the 18th century, the novel is invented, and this is a powerful impetus for these new ways of thinking. Anyway, when the clicker works again, I want to show you this man because I want to tell you the story that epitomizes all these trends of Jean Hume, the brilliant and only daughter of this man. We have no picture of Jean Hume. We have many pictures of her father because he was one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. He's called Henry Hume, Lord Keynes. And the story of his daughter is that in the early 1760s, when she was only 16 or 17 years old, she was already married, probably married off to an army officer. And shortly after she's married, she begins a passionate affair with a man called James Boswell. And I know about this because I found in Boswell's diaries an anguished account of the progress of this affair. And it's anguished because Boswell is a great protege of Keynes. So in the afternoon, he goes and has tea with Lord and Lady Keynes, and then in the evening, unbeknownst to them, behind their back, he's having sex with their married daughter. And after a while, this becomes too much for him, and he goes to Jean and says, "I don't think we should do this. I think it's wrong." And in his diary, he records what she said in response. It's really remarkable. She argues to him that they did nothing wrong. This is what Boswell writes. She was a subtle philosopher. She said, "I love my husband as a husband, and you as a lover, each in his own sphere. I perform for him all the duties of a good wife. With you, I give myself up to delicious pleasures. We keep our secret. Nature has so made me that I don't think I shall bear children. No one suffers because of our love. My conscience does not reproach me. I'm sure that God cannot be offended, so there's nothing wrong." And then Boswell writes, "What could I do? She convinced me completely. I had to continue the illicit amour." But then, tragically, a decade later, when Jean's husband divorces her after discovering her in another affair, similarly, she declared publicly that she hoped that God Almighty would not punish her for the only crime she could charge herself with, which was the gratification of those passions which God himself had implanted in her nature. Now, these were, of course, exactly the same arguments, the same kinds of ways of thinking that men from the 18th century onwards were using to justify their sexual freedom. But Jean Hume's father, the great scholar, the great moral authority, took the completely conventional view, and he wrote and published about this as well. The conventional view was that adultery in a man may happen occasionally with little or no alienation of affection. That's Keynes's phrase. Adultery in a man is a trivial matter, doesn't mean anything. But in a woman, it was unpardonable. And so when Jean Hume was found in adultery and divorced by her husband, her parents, Lord and Lady Hume, exiled her to France and never spoke to her again as long as she lived. So the origins of what we often think of as Victorian prudery and repression and the desexualization of women, they too lie in this first sexual revolution. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with my final theme, which is the private and the public. This is the point at which the modern distinction between the public and the private is developed. And ever since, we've been grappling in the West with the problem of exactly where to draw the line between them. Now, unsurprisingly, the first and the loudest advocates of sexual privacy were naughty politicians, like this man, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, invented the sandwich, but also slept with a lot of women. And what he said in the 1780s is a characteristically modern way of male thinking. Other people, he said, should forgive my weaknesses when they do not interfere with my conduct as a public man. So private character and public conduct, it could now be asserted, were two completely separate, unrelated things. And that's one way of thinking that has been put forward endlessly ever since then. Unfortunately for the politicians, this was also exactly the moment at which the modern mass media were invented. The end of censorship, the rise of the newspaper, the explosion of urban life, all these things created a completely new universe of public communication and an unprecedented interest in the discussion and the publicizing of sex. So from this point onwards, sex is not just more and more private, it also becomes more and more public. And that's a great modern tension, a great modern paradox, which goes right back to this moment. Now, all the tricks of the modern media are invented in the 18th century. I'm going to show you one of my favorite pictures of an 18th century kind of bit of expose reporting. And I love, you won't be able to read this, but at the bottom it just says in a very dry way, Miss Roberts, naked in the lap of Lord Grosvenor at the hotel in Cumberland Park. Anyway, in the 18th century, all the tricks of the mass media are invented. Lots of people, I have to tell you this at this festival, a lot of people in the 18th century reviewed their own books. James Boswell, for example, who I told you about, is a genius at this. He would write a book anonymously, he would dedicate it to himself, and then he would review it rapturously in the newspaper, also anonymously. So it's a work of genius, you must go and buy it. Anyway, it's also the first age of celebrity memoirs, in which very often it's the case, a woman who's had a life of excitement and sexual interest, like, let me give you an example, Margaret Leeson. Oh, never mind about the picture. Anyway, women in the 18th century for the first time, There she is, Margaret Leeson. This is her in her prime, the most famous courtesan of 18th century Dublin. And then, when she's down on her luck a few decades later, she, like any modern celebrity, she cashes in by writing her memoirs in 3 volumes. She tells everything. She's kept all the letters of her lovers. She prints them all. She tells all the stories of her seduction, of hijinks in high society, all the men she slept with, etc. Endless details. No wonder it becomes a huge bestseller. And all this is bad news for politicians who jilt their lovers. Here's an example of that. In 1806, Mary Ann Clark, who has been the mistress of the Duke of York, is cast off by him without a proper settlement. And so she strikes back straight away. She writes, she sits down, she writes, she has printed 14,000 copies of a sensational memoir with all of the Duke's love letters to her. And then she writes him a note saying, I've printed 14,000 copies. And he cracks and he gives way. And this is the result. She gets this gigantic payoff. If you look in the corner, on the right-hand corner of the picture, you can see Mary Ann Clark running off with a big smile on her face and huge money bags under her arms. She gets a huge payoff and a pension for life. And the printers in the middle also very happy. In the background, you can see the sheets of her memoir that are being consigned to the flames, and the aristocrats relieved that their secrets are now safe. I'm going to end by taking you back to the moment at which this phenomenon of sexual celebrity really took off. I think I've identified actually the week in which we can say this started to become big business. And it's in the spring of 1759, And I'm going to show you a picture of the woman who did it. Here she is. She's called Kitty Fisher. In 1759, she is the most famous sexual celebrity in the world. Every move she makes is chronicled in the papers. Everything she does, every dinner she goes to, every time she goes to the theatre, every time she has a new hairstyle, it is immediately big news, avidly read by tens of thousands of people. But mainly, this is a form of exploitation by the hacks, by the journalists of the 18th century, of this woman. She's exploited by the mass media. And this reaches its zenith one day in March 1759, when she goes riding in St. James's Park. She often goes riding. She's very good at riding. She enjoys doing it. But on that day, for some reason, her horse is startled and she falls off her horse. So it's a split-second occurrence. Could happen to anyone. If I went riding in St. James's Park, it would doubtless happen to me. When it happens to Kitty Fisher in 1759, it is huge news. Immediately, special editions are rushed out. I kid you not. Pictures are engraved about this. Entire books are written about this single incident. For months and months and months, people are still talking and reading and producing stuff about it. Here's a broadsheet, Horse and Away, the same day this comes out. Here's a picture of a family of hawkers in London. The man, if you can see on the screen, has a fishing rod. It's a hilarious pun on the name of Kitty Fisher. And he's saying, the text below says, "Come, come, who'll fish in my fish pond?" And he's hawking ballads about Kitty Fisher, and the family in the back are singing them so that you'll be attracted and want to buy this. Anyway, all this kind of stuff is happening to exploit her celebrity. And at this point, she has had enough. And she does two unprecedented things. First of all, she takes out an ad in the newspapers complaining about how she's being exploited and telling people not to buy this garbage. She says, you can see the first line maybe, "To err is a blemish entailed upon mortality." We are all human, we're all fallible, she says. We all make mistakes, we all fall off our horses. But I'm being treated abominably by the hack press. They are putting out pictures pretending to be of me. They're not of me. They're even pretending to publish my memoirs. I haven't written my memoirs. Don't buy this stuff, she says. It's hackery. That's the first thing. And the second thing she does, a few days later, she walks across town into the studio of this man. This is Sir Joshua Reynolds, the greatest portrait painter of the 18th century, the greatest image maker of his time. And together, they sit down and they start to craft a new image for her. They take control of the message and they start to pump out, and after her, every courtesan does this, authorized, beautiful pictures that show her how she wants to be seen. Here is Kitty Fisher, not splayed on the floor with her legs apart, falling off a horse, but as Cleopatra, trying to impress Mark Antony, dissolving a pearl in wine. And on the left, you see Reynolds' picture, which fashionable people can see exhibited in his studio and in exhibitions and so on. But on the right, even more importantly, you see one of the thousands and thousands of prints that they immediately commissioned for the mass market. Every such picture is now available in tens of thousands of copies right away in all the print shops, so all the common people can have and put them up. These are the first pin-ups, if you like, and they're born in the 18th century. You can even buy, this is my favorite, this tiny, tiny image. This is this big, really literally just an inch. And why is it that big and why is it that size? It's that big and that size because you can cut it out. You can also buy it coloured for twopence. This is 1 penny. You cut it out and you put it in your pocket watch as a man so that you can travel around and whenever you want a private moment with Kitty, you open it up and you gaze down. And there she is, gazing back at you privately. You possess her completely. It's remarkable. It's like carrying it around on your mobile phone. It's an extraordinary thing. And remember, this is her doing. This is what she wants her fans to do. And I want to end with my favorite picture of her. It's a picture on the front of my book. this is another wonderful portrait that she has commissioned, and it shows her how she wants to be seen. And what's remarkable about it, I draw your attention not just to her extraordinary beauty and her seductive gaze, nor even to the hilarious 18th century pun in the corner of the kitty fishing in the goldfish bowl. Kitty Fisher, get it? It's hilarious. Now, I want, if you can, look into the middle of the goldfish bowl, and you'll see there a reflection of the window of the room in which she is sitting and being painted. Can you see it? Okay, look at that and think about what that is. She is showing us that. What she's showing us is her fans pressing in at the window, trying to get a glimpse of her, the famous celebrity. I think it's a wonderful epitome of the nature of modern celebrity and indeed of the new world that was created by the first sexual revolution. Thank you very much.
Farah, thank you for that amazing tour de force. You can see, for anyone looking behind you, you can see incredible crowds which have only grown in the course of this lecture. People have deserted all the other venues and come to listen to your filthy stories. We've got time for about 1 or 2 questions. So who's got a really good question that isn't at all boring?
All right, it better be. There's no pressure.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering whether the advent of HIV/AIDS, did that have any impact on the sexual freedom, on the sexual movement, and have you written about it in your book?
The last part of the book is about the modern world, it's about the 19th and the 20th centuries. And part of that is about the increasing paranoia about same-sex relations. And you see that really, as you probably know, reaching its height in the late 20th century, and HIV is a key marker of that. The similar kinds of things happened in the 18th century with syphilis, which is a great scourge. So people who want to argue against sexual freedom see this as a sign of God. Others see it as a disease that needs to be cured. Thank you.
We have one question here on the right.
You have traced only to a certain point. Why didn't you include the 20th century? For instance, Bertrand Russell was thrown out of the job for writing Marriage and Morals, and he didn't have any objection, lover sitting with his wife. So this is also, thing you have to make more relevant to the 21st century.
It was very cool, but I was only given 45 minutes. But if you read the last bit of the book, it will all become clear. Thank you.
Okay, I think we might need to wrap it up there. Is there one final question from a youngster that's a fabulous question? Yeah. Got one just here.
Thank you. Hi. What would you say is the relationship between the movement of sexual relations from the public to the private and sexual violence? Marital rape, for example, is often justified on the basis that it's a private relationship and a private transaction.
Yes. I think that in general, I think that's a very good question. I think in general, the rise of the idea of sexual freedom for men sharpens the sexual double standard tremendously. And marital rape in England, marital rape is not outlawed until 1991. I mean, it's an extraordinary late acknowledgement of this problem. So, on the other hand, the acknowledgement of sexual violence and the feminist voices rising up against it do become more and more powerful through the 18th and 19th century. That's also a result of the changes I talked about. Thanks.
So many thanks. As a gesture of thanks from the DFC Literature Festival, a scarf for you. Would you like one as well? There we go. Thank you so much for your patience and for taking part in that. I'm so sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but Farah will be going over to the book signing table. So please, please go with him over there. Get a copy if you can. If you need signatures, questions, he'll be over there. Now, just to also let you know, lunch for the delegates and speakers, it goes from 12 o'clock all the way through to 3 o'clock. And you can go and with your pass, if you have a delegate pass, you can go underneath the press terrace to the right of the front lawns. Everybody else, you're welcome to obviously eat at any time at any of the stalls, but please just make sure that you put your rubbish in the bins. That would be much appreciated. We have a lost sweater here. We're actually giving out the DSC Jaipur Literature Prize on the front lawns at 6 o'clock. So if you want to go along to that, that'll be at 6 o'clock.